Hi, I'm Kim Messenger.
And I'm Kate Anderson. And together we host the Project Management Happy Hour podcast, where we discuss real-world issues in project management and share some of our hard lessons learned. We get to speak with hundreds of listeners and members about their project management journey.
And as we say on our show, we've made all the mistakes that we're going to try to help you avoid today. Today we're going to go over how to handle an organization change with an in-progress project. Lots of project managers that we've spoken with have struggled with communicating to new stakeholders during an organization change, or how to handle project communications when the org structure changes. So our goal today is to give you tools and strategies to deal with these kinds of changes. To start off, it's important to understand that projects are sort of like the ships of strategy execution.
Ooh.
And your organization's strategies set the course for your ship. Projects harness the wind and the waves to get us there, captained by our trusty project managers, our fearless leaders on our ambitious journey. Projects deliver on organizational goals. They're funded and given resources, including you as a project manager, with the expectation that there will be a return on that investment, which furthers the organization's strategy.
To pull an example from history, if we were, say, the Dutch East India Company, our strategy is to ship goods around the world that people want to purchase. As a business, we notice cinnamon is really catching on. It's great on lattes, you can mix it with pumpkin, and you can make cinnamon rolls. It is worth the investment of additional ships and crew to obtain more cinnamon for our bottom line.
Now, although simplified, this is an example of how an organization's strategy can drive its project work.
So how do org changes play into all of this? The strategy of the organization is reflected in the structure of the organization. So when the strategy changes, the organization changes, and often the projects change. We do a lot of mentoring with our podcast members, and org changes come up all the time. The business world feels like it has never settled down since the pandemic. The business landscape changes, strategies change, and so organizations change seemingly nonstop. And as a project manager, it can feel like, we finally got our project going, woo! Yeah. And then, boom, organization changes. Teams are moving from one leader to another, a new department is spun up, or sometimes spun down, and priorities may shift, but it's not always immediately clear what is coming next.
Ah, the winds of change. It's sort of like, you're doing your thing at work, and you get this email from the Chancellor of the Republic which says, hey, there's a reorg. It's called Order 66. Don't know what it means yet, but we'll just be patient, and we'll have to wait until someone comes around and talks to us about it, you know?
We love to say the only constant is change, but it's especially true in this case. If you work in project management, you'll certainly run into an org change in your tenure.
Yeah, and with this context, we need to understand that change which is impacting your project is probably having a much bigger and broader impact to the entire organization than just your cute little project. So I reference an example from my past where we had an organizational change and it was impacting my project, and I escalated it, I raised it to my VP, and I was in his office saying, you need to stop this, you're affecting my project. I've been working on this project for 6 months, we've got a team, we've got stakeholders, we need to focus more on the project. And he told me, he said, you are being myopic.
Ooh, what a terrible insult.
It burned at the time, but I always remember that because he was right. I was focused just on my project, not being mindful or respectful of the fact that there were bigger and probably more important changes going on at the time.
And that's a powerful lesson to share. Thank you for that, Kim. And while a project manager should advocate for their project, they must also not be myopic and understand that there are bigger, more important things going on within an organization during an organizational change than just their project.
Right. One way you can feel about these winds of change when they come is that you open up your inbox on a Monday morning and you receive an email from your boss's boss's boss that says, hey, we're so excited about the next step in our journey. Here's a new org structure to help you achieve our company's goals. And it could also be, we just got acquired by this great company, or we just bought this other great company, or we have a new CIO and this department's moving over there.
Organizational change can feel like a storm disrupting your journey. You've lost your sponsors, potentially some team members, and there's new leaders with new goals on the horizon.
So what do you do? right? You got to keep your morale up, and it can feel like the world is coming down around you as your work landscape changes, but this is an opportunity.
Reorgs are political. They're subjective. No reorg is ever the same. Sometimes companies shift from a centralized matrix structure to a decentralized project team-based structure, or vice versa. And sometimes companies shift priorities. A particular area of the business is deprioritized, while another area is elevated to the highest priority. Many companies did this during COVID, turning down or entirely removing a priority on in-person work or product offerings while focusing instead on remote and social distanced opportunities.
But we feel organizational changes are an opportunity because it gives you a time that you can really highlight your strengths. So don't sit in your cabin by yourself and complain about being seasick. Don't be the person who just cries, "Why does this happen? Oh no." Changes are a regular part of business. Complaining or causing extra churn or extra drama by simply bemoaning the turbulence is not contributing to getting stuff done or getting back to stability.
If you are running a project or a team during an org change, it is naive to think that the org change will not impact you. But at the same time, it's bad business to just stop working during an org change. There is a high chance that the work in progress is still valuable to the company. Typically, all work in progress comes under review during an org change.
As will your performance.
At some point after an org change, there should be a review to ensure that all the projects are still aligned with new priorities and new org, and this is actually very good.
So on comes the tempest of change. And how do we handle this big change, this big organizational change that maybe people don't even want to talk about, this elephant in the room?
Well, I'm a big Brené Brown fan. She is a researcher storyteller who has decades of research and books out there on shame and vulnerability. And one of her tools she teaches us is to get curious when you're feeling vulnerable. A reorg can feel extremely vulnerable, but if we sit and tell ourselves the worst outcomes, we'll be stuck and potentially paralyzed by fear. Instead of succumbing to the maelstrom of the unknown, get curious. Be interested and curious about those new priorities that are coming, which may or may not have been announced yet, because sometimes org changes are announced before the priorities in work, and conversely, sometimes the priorities are announced before the org changes.
Yeah, I've loved this, and I've used it ever since you walked us through it on our podcast when you talked about the book Crucial Conversations. And I love this idea of getting curious, and I've used it ever since you shared it with us on our podcast. Whenever I feel frustrated or anxious, I just stop and get curious about what's going on in my head, my team members' heads, or even the organization.
Yeah, take that curiosity into these conversations about change. Say, oh, why did you decide to do that? That's very exciting. What are you hoping to get out of this? That approach is really powerful in situations like this.
So in this particular instance, where we're talking about an organization change, can you walk us through some specific ways that we can get curious?
Oh, absolutely. One place to start is orienting yourself. Where is my team? Who do I report to? Who's my team reporting to? Has any of that changed? You can also check on your stakeholders, determine if those folks have changed and who they may be in the future. It can be a little bit like an organizational Where's Waldo when trying to find your sponsor in a new or changing organization. So as much as you can, leverage your internal work network. Share with your trusted peers about the work you're doing and devour the new strategies and priorities that come down from leadership. Discuss with mentors and leaders on what their goals are in this new world order. And then analyze if your work aligns to new strategies and priorities or if it's potentially on the to-be-cut list.
Now, as tough as this situation is, it is an opportunity for you to demonstrate good, strong leadership. So keep your communication tight, keep it strong. Keep your documentation and any process deliverables that you are responsible for up to date. And keep your team and stakeholders aligned and up to date. You want to sort of batten down the hatches, so to speak, when you feel there are organizational changes, especially if you think that those might affect your project.
You could also say that the project manager has to remember where the North Star of this project is, keep the project pointing that way, and remind everyone which direction we are going and why.
Yeah, you sort of have to go back to the beginning. When there's a big change or the course is uncertain, you can almost think of it as an opportunity to revisit the very beginning, the origins and the purpose of your project. You may need to go back to the beginning stages of project justification and even reinitialize it, and if not formally, maybe informally might be a good idea. There were really good reasons why your project was funded, reasons it was prioritized, and reasons why it was staffed. And you may find that you have to re-justify that whole journey and origination story. And usually the way this goes down, you know this,
I do,
is your boss calls you at 4:45 p.m. on a Friday and says, hey, I need all this data on your project. Where are we? How much have you spent? How much budget is left? What resources do you need to finish? And by the way, I need that by 5 p.m.
I have been there.
Yeah.
You should have that justification and a summary of your project ready at hand, especially if you start to sense these changes are coming. That documentation should be readily available from your project charter, your scope document, your success criteria. It should be information you already have. And you need to be on top of it because this really does happen, and you need to be ready to provide that information and potentially even resell your project.
Yeah, even I don't want to read all those docs sometimes, though.
They can be meaty. So fear not. If you're not sure how to communicate all of that information concisely, have we got a format for you?
It's a basic tool, but it's one of our favorite. It's called a project overview presentation. And you can think of it as a sales tool for your project. It's a briefing. It's almost like a pitch deck for your project.
It is the perfect tool for communicating your project to other people in the organization. It provides a brief summary of what your project is about and what it's supposed to deliver and how. It's a great tool for an org change. The people you need to communicate with most when org changes happen are managers and executives. And you need to have a communication tool which they can not only easily understand and remember, among the 10,000 other things they have to remember, but something they can also easily take to their peers and superiors as talking points they can use.
Yep. Think of it as a tool to teach your sponsors and stakeholders how to think about, talk about, and even how to sell your project. And we're going to talk you through what goes into a basic overview, but the key thing is this. For all this content, you need to talk in headlines. Keep it punchy, short, memorable, so simple that even an executive can understand it.
Woo! Shout out to our dumb executives.
Woo!
You may be tempted to add a lot of details into this deck because, like me, you may think, oh my gosh, my project is so important and has all these benefits. If my leaders know everything I know about my project, they will definitely want to keep my project. And I caution you, don't make the mistakes I've made. Keep it as simple and focused as possible. Your audience is only going to remember a couple things about your project, maybe even only one thing about your project. What do you need them to remember? The more detail you add, the less detail they will remember.
That's a PowerPoint mic drop. Moment. Can you say that one more time?
The more detail you add, the less detail they will remember.
All right. So let's talk about this deck. It only has 8 things in it, so let's dive in. So the first slide is about whose project is this, right? Who decided to do this project and why are they doing it? What are they expecting? And here you want to list the people, the organization, the sponsors, and the roles. And this gives you a way to provide context to your new audience. Who wanted this and why? Who is interested in seeing this successful? With changing executives and changing organizations, it could mean that this project needs different sponsors in order to be successful. Is this the CEO's project or is it sponsored by a technical manager? The context says a lot about the project.
And as a side note, speaking from experience, if your sponsor was let go in a reorg, I might not put that sponsor's name on here if it's still an important project. Maybe just reference the role rather than the person. Alternatively, if you want your project to be cut, consider putting your departed sponsor's name on it. And here's a simplified example of what that might look like. And as you can see, we've got our project sponsors for our imaginary example project and what their goals were by sponsoring it. Which brings us to our second slide, goals and measures of success. This should be a clear and concise way of describing the value your project is providing or delivering. Arguably, this is the most important slide. It's the elevator pitch of your project, and it must be the punchiest slide. you are communicating if the business invests in this project, the business should see a measurable improvement in a measurable area. Your new stakeholders have ideas in mind for their vision and direction. And if you can clearly communicate opportunity and measures of success, they will better understand what value your project provides the business.
Because it's so important, this slide should definitely be circulated around your trusted peer group at work to get feedback on the slide and ensure that it conveys the real value of your project in a very concise way. And here is an example. Here you can see we've got very concrete metrics, we've got some graphics. Always love to have graphics in executive presentations.
Yes.
And it's straight and to the point for the 3 things we want to accomplish for this project and what that value is. And that takes us to slide 3, problem description and scope. This slide summarizes the problem or the opportunity and the solution that your project is meant to deliver through its scope. If you want to add more sentences, more content to this slide, don't. Okay, for example, you may want to add more data, the options that you evaluated, how much your cat likes the scope, but don't. If you want to add more data, don't do it here. Stick it in a backup slide that you can put at the end of the presentation, sort of like an appendix. But keep this slide punchy and focused on the problem at hand. And let's take a quick look at an example.
So we can see here, we've listed out the problem in 2 sentences and offered our solution as 3 bullet points as the specific scope that we are delivering for the project. You want to do the exact same thing in your project overview presentation. And then that brings us to the money slide.
The money slide.
This is going to be very important to your stakeholders. Here you're going to describe the investment, including hard money, resources, people and employees, and any other commitments needed to make the project happen. Critically, you also have to share the anticipated return on the investment. What's the expected benefit of this project? Ideally, you are able to identify a hard financial return on the investment, such as dollars saved or additional revenue added to the company, but it's possible that benefits may be a bit softer and harder to quantify.
Right, just because some benefits might be soft, they might be more difficult to quantify, don't leave them out. Call out the headline benefit that your project has to offer. For example, you can include other metrics like time it takes to produce your product, how many people it takes to do the product, customer satisfaction, soft benefits like that that are harder to quantify with a hard dollar value. Hard or soft, this slide should convey all of the value that your project is meant to deliver to the organization. And let's take a quick look at an example.
So we can see on this slide, we're talking about today in our problem area around funding and investment. We are then comparing that to the project and the funding and team that we have with our work that we're trying to do, and then a future-looking view of what we're forecasting future finances and team size to be. This slide should be an obvious no-brainer that the project is a good investment and we're going to receive that return on investment once the work is completed.
Right, and you may flavor this slide a little bit towards what your organization's preferences are. Maybe some of them like to see more financials, maybe less financials, more on the people side. You'll just need to customize this to your organization's needs. Go on to slide 5, the timeline. Everybody loves a timeline, especially a project manager. So just keep it high level. Don't hit them with your 1,200 line project schedule.
You can't even fit 1,200 lines on
I don't
the
know.
slide.
If I get the font real small, maybe I could.
Don't fall into that trap.
Don't do it. It's mostly about context here. Where are we? Are we just getting started? Are we nearly done? What's the next big milestone that we can expect out of this project? And you can use the format of a single line timeline. You can even just do a table of key milestones, or you can use a big box Gantt, which is what we like to call them, which we'll show you an example of that here in a moment.
Put yourself in the shoes of a busy leader who just needs to know the essentials. An easy set of dates to put on this slide are your classic phase gates. We've got kickoff, discovery, design, build, test, and launch. If any of these are in the past, just add a date for when the project started and keep them focused on the next big dates. Other potential dates that could be good to include here could be any payments due dates on a contract, a regulatory requirement date, a contractually agreed delivery date, or any major events your project is centered around, such as a holiday or other seasonal event, or finally, an annual cutoff date. These dates, if you do add them to this slide, should add context for why your schedule looks the way that it does.
Right, and here's an example of a very basic, what we call a big box Gantt chart, where we just have the major milestones showing where they are in context. We have a little flag that says, hey, here's where we are, to give context to our current location in that timeline.
And importantly, you're also communicating, this is when we will be done, and you will see that value that we talked about on the previous slide.
And it'll also show when they can expect value, the different milestones from here until the end of the project, which is usually something of great interest.
Which brings us to our risks. This is where the project can go off the rails and what you're doing to keep it on track. We love a RAID log format for risks, so we want you to include your highest severity risk with the most likelihood when presenting to executives. It is important that this content is relevant to executives, so you don't want to include everything that could possibly go wrong, just the big ticket items that they should be aware of and potentially be informed of so they can do something about those risks or issues.
Right, and you can absolutely include risks that are things going on that are directly a cause of the organization change. That might actually be very useful to put in here. And so here's an example. You can see we did not put the entire risk register in here. We just limited it to maybe 2 very high criticality risks that would be of interest to our sponsors and stakeholders. And now, at this point in the deck, we've given a solid context for the project. Whose project is it? What is success? What exactly are we doing and what are we trying to solve? How much is it going to cost and what's the value we're going to get in return? When is all this going to happen and what can go wrong? So now we have to summarize where we are with a status slide.
And to do that, we want a simple, high-level, graphics-rich status slide. As we mentioned earlier, executives love a graphic. We want to say, here's what we've done, here's where we are, and here's what's next. Let's look at that example.
All right, this is a little redacted, but it gives you a layout for a typical one-slide status report. We've got a very basic milestone timeline on the top, maybe a burn down chart, an executive summary, what we've accomplished last period, what we're going to do in the future period, and your basic RAG indicators in the upper right. And finally, maybe most importantly, maybe, the last slide outlines your asks from your audience. Even if your audience doesn't remember anything else from this presentation, they will hopefully remember what they need to do in order to support you and your project. And so having an ask slide is a great way to get your sponsors and stakeholders engaged, especially if they're new to the project.
And if you don't have anything to ask, if you're very lucky and things are going well, you could ask if they would like to see any of this work accelerated or if they are confident with the current timelines and ask for a regular cadence to review this work with them.
So Kate, as a project manager, would you actually ask to accelerate your project?
Asking if executives would like to accelerate is a tactful way to ask for more funding or people on your project. If your leadership is keen to see outcomes that your project can provide, they may decide to add additional people from deprioritized work or use some discretionary budget they are saving for their priority projects.
Very clever.
It's a clever tool.
All right. Let's take a look at an ask slide. In this slide, you can see we start off with sort of a tagline for our project, re-emphasizing the value that our project gives, and then our list of asks to our audience. And again, we want to keep this short. We don't want to list 10, 12 different asks.
No.
And this slide should also be customized for each audience. So you may present this to your executive sponsor, to whom you may have different asks than when you present to other stakeholders.
Yes, that's a good point. So let's talk about pitching your deck.
Let's do that. Now that you've got this great deck, which is simple, punchy, eloquent, what do you do with it now?
Well, if you're going to deliver this to a room full of executives, that should not be the first time you do that presentation.
No.
You should get a work friend or a trusted peer, ideally someone with not too much knowledge of your project, to listen to your overview. Have them provide you with their takeaways at the end of your presentation and see if it lines up with what you wanted the takeaways to be.
Yeah, once you're good there, you can even review it with just 1 or 2 key stakeholders first before taking it to the whole executive board or to key executives. You can get their early feedback, incorporate it into your deck, and iterate it, refining it each time that you present it. Now, if we step back for a moment, an overview deck is not just for when the organization goes bananas. But if you have a big project that touches a lot of stakeholders, a lot of groups in your organization, an overview deck is a great communication tool at the beginning of the project when you need to tell everybody about your project for the very first time. And just the simple act of creating a project overview in the early stages of a project is a great discovery exercise for yourself and for your team. And it's absolutely essential when you take over an existing project because it's a great discovery exercise. And honestly, if you can't get enough information to fill out an overview presentation, then you probably have bigger problems to worry about.
So let's consider the different perspectives of change impacting an internal project manager, somebody who's an FTE within a company, versus an external project manager who's part of a different company, who's contracted as an outside consultant to a company to deliver some sort of internal work. And when we were originally thinking about this topic, my thought was that this whole topic leans much more towards internal project managers. Everything in the project and everyone they depend on in the org can change, unlike external project managers who aren't affected at all.
Then I said, haha, no! Having done a lot of work as an external project manager myself, usually as a supplier delivering projects to a company, I have seen catastrophic impacts to our projects when our customer has an org change. Our very customers, the people who decided to pay us to come in and do something, can change roles or completely leave the organization. And in fact, some of the most disastrous projects that I've had to go and remediate were a mess because the supplier tried to ignore and just roll past the fact that the sponsoring department or the sponsor themselves changed. And the new owners of the project at the customer had totally different expectations that were not aligned or agreed with us or with the contract. So you can't ignore it. It might go so far as to say that a change within your customer's organization can be every bit as impactful as a change within your own organization.
And while on the topic of communication, don't just keep your head down. I might say you should consider raising your voice in the face of the winds of change. Be vocal about the challenges that you're having, but also be vocal about the wins and the successes. When big changes happen, everyone is in panic mode. Be the voice that is strong enough to call out the good things that are still going on.
And so speaking of that, and through all these changes, we cannot forget our crew. As a project manager, you may be concerned about whether or not you will still have a project, but recognize that your team and your stakeholders may be concerned about whether or not they will still have a job. And so as a leader, you should expect that your team will model your behavior. If you are freaking out about the changes, saying, oh my gosh, this is crap, another reorg, I'm going to start looking for another job, your team is going to follow that behavior, or at least they're going to respect you a lot less for your behavior.
Oof. To avoid that, instead, stay calm. Focus on what you do know, be confident, and keep at it. However small the project, you're a leader for that team. And if you're not confident about the future of the work, your team is probably even less confident. They look to you as a leader. It's an opportunity for you to demonstrate calm in the face of the storm. So our change finally happens. Finally. And you will either keep the course, change course, or go back to shore. Let's run through these scenarios.
So let's say your orders stay the course. Maybe make some small changes, but you get through the change and your project is still going. Yay!
Woo!
Now that the change is over, there will not be any more changes ever, forever. Whew, glad that's over.
Ha! All right, Kim. Change is the nature of what we do. We are project managers. Our job is to change things. So don't be put off by it and don't think that that change is over.
Ride the wave.
The next option is that your orders are adjust the course to new heading, but keep going, i.e. a scope change. If you do have a scope change, keep a holistic view. Go back to your PMBOK basics and think in terms of integrated change control. No change in your project happens in isolation. New team members, new budgets, new schedules, any change will impact other project parameters. Do your homework as a project manager and integrate any changes to all dimensions of your project.
Finally, there is the possibility that your voyage will end. Even if you feel like you did all the right things, your project can still be sunk.
Let's not say sunk. We can say called back to port.
That's much better, much better. It's not an end to your world, and as we've discussed, it can actually be the right and the best thing, so don't take it personally. And that sounds scary and that sounds difficult, but it's much worse if the project should be killed and isn't, which happens way too often.
That is a zombie project. Those are the projects that fall into the just keep up the momentum trap, or they go into autopilot and just keep going for no apparent reason. They should be dead, but they aren't quite. These are the types of projects where, as you explain whatever it is you're delivering, you go, because so-and-so wanted it, I don't really know what value we're providing.
Yeah, and when zombie projects finally do end, which they will, organizations realize, wow, that was an incredible waste of time. We really didn't get any value out of that. So it's actually a good thing when leadership comes around and says, okay, what is your project about, and does it still fit with what we need to do?
And sometimes the answer is obvious, but nobody wants to say it out loud. And you as the project manager may have to be the one that says, I don't know that this project makes sense anymore. Can we talk through this and see if it does or if it doesn't? It takes a lot of courage as a PM to question the validity of your project, even if sometimes it's the right thing to do. Having a frank discussion around investment outcomes and ROI against the strategies that are presented by the reorg is the best way to have that conversation.
And strangely, when you are in this situation and you start asking your sponsors, hey, do we still really need this project? Are you really still ready to back this project? It can actually energize them to defend the project and work on your behalf even harder than if you didn't ask that.
Strange reverse psychology thing. Don't you get rid of my baby.
Really. But anyway, if that doesn't work and you need to shut down the project, just remember to be responsible about closing the project. When we end the project prematurely, we usually don't just drop everything and walk away. There's usually some closure to do and thank yous for the team, of course.
Well, let's talk about some things that might indicate you're in trouble. On our podcast, we talk about you might be in trouble if, so we want to share that with you here today.
You might be in trouble if there be krakens, project krakens.
Yes, you might be in trouble if there are krakens literally trying to eat your project. But you may also be in trouble if you keep your head down and try to keep out of it. It's like you're a bad driver and you try to blow through a yellow light with your eyes closed.
Yeah, you might also be in trouble if you are freaking out about the change on the outside. You can freak out on the inside, that's totally okay.
Totally fine.
Don't freak out in front of your team and your stakeholders.
You might be in trouble if you couldn't write a project overview document today, because if you can't, do you even really understand your project? Does anybody really want to see it successful? You've got to have enough information to write that document.
Yeah, and on that same line of thought, you might be in trouble if you can't figure out who you would give your project overview presentation to. There may be an exception out there, but really, if nobody would care enough about your project to sit and listen to or read an overview, then how valuable is your project to the business really?
Ooh, that's a mic drop moment.
Shall we recap?
I'd love to recap.
Let's recap. Projects are the vehicles of strategy execution, and reorganization sometimes mean that the strategy has changed.
And so, your project must change.
Right. And change is an opportunity, so embrace it.
Create your project overview document, share it over and over again to as many people as you can.
And if your project does get cut, don't take it personally. It was probably a good business decision. Thank you for joining us today. If you would like to connect with Kate or I on LinkedIn, we would love to continue the conversation, so please reach out to us on LinkedIn.
You can find us at our podcast at pmhappyhour.com or anywhere you get your podcasts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.